In this topic, we'll be exploring terrain analysis, digital terrain depiction, models, and analytical techniques using rasters, TINs, isopleths. Talk a little bit about terrain, surf data sets, and then generally how the concept of surfaces works into um, how we do terrain modeling and analysis. So once again, DEMs are regular grids or rasters filled with information about the Earth's surface, ideally georeferenced to the Earth's surface. And in particular, the foundation type of information that we use here, the DEM, is digital elevation models. So all of the information contained within the raster should be elevation. Typically, that's going to be measured in meters or in feet, and both for vertical and for horizontal distances. They should both be in the same units. But remember that what makes this thing work is it's a regularly spaced grid of these values across space. So it functions sort of like, using a modern analogy, kind of like Minecraft blocks, depicting area, uh, height, and volume. So here's some examples of some of the more routine things that we can do with DEMs, creating different kinds of information. The upper left is a raw DEM. Just to the right of that is a slope grid, and below it from left to right would be aspect, a hillshade, and then elevation contour values. So here's a table from our secondary text that's just indicating some of the things that people routinely do, generating surfaces off of DEMs. And here we kind of need to define what this term surface is. And when I use it, what I'm talking about and what I mean is that it is a continuous raster that, or maybe another type of a spatial model, but it covers space entirely. It doesn't have any gaps in it. A surface is a complete covering for a particular study area, for a region. It doesn't have any gaps in it, doesn't have any breaks in it. There are no holes. There may be very high points, very low points. There may be depressions indicated by elevation values and ridges and things like that, but it's a complete surface, as the name kind of implies. And so I'm not going to go through all of these examples here. You can pause and read them if you need to, or you can read them in the text. But we'll go through some of these as examples in this particular lecture. So here we go. Calculating slope is pretty straightforward. It's rise over run, calculated in degrees or percentage, depending upon your application and perhaps the career path or the field you're working in, or your analytical protocol may call for one or the other of these. Degrees and percent. ARC calculates them pretty handily. And by sight alone, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between whether it's um, in degrees or in a percentage. So you need to look at the metadata for that. But the calculation is just like you're familiar with from geometry, the rise over the run, either way. And then there are the values for you, and there's in the inset some comparisons between different degrees and percentages. So a 30-degree slope, 58% slope. 45-degree slope is 100%. 75 degrees is 370%. Slope, as it turns out mathematically, is infinite. So you can have values that may not seem like they make sense. So again, you need to look at the metadata. You need to look at the actual values for your slope data set if someone hands you one, to make sure you understand what the values are and that you're going to be able to use them properly in your analysis. Aspect is maybe more commonly thought of as compass direction. And so what happens here is the DEM is queried, and based upon the elevation differences and looking at the slope, it can determine where those cells are facing in compass directions, and so that's what you're getting out of it. If you're standing on a higher elevation cell, and below it, to the north, there's lower and lower and lower elevations, then it calculates that's a slope that's facing to the north, and so forth, around the compass dial. And so the output grid is going to be, in ArcGIS, is going to be multicolored, as you see here, and those colors are going to correspond to the different values, compass values, that go from 0 being north, clockwise around the dial, back to 360, which is also north. So it's an angular measurement, and since they're essentially categorical information, the best way to portray this is the rainbow. And so a default kind of rainbow coloration pattern will be assigned to the categorical values in the ArcGIS table of contents. And then if you need to focus in on a particular aspect range, then you just reclass the entire grid and produce whatever you need from it. Let's see here, if I remember right, when you save aspect, if you just export it as a data set, it will not save the multicolor combination by default. It'll turn up gray, so it'll look grayscale, which means it may look something very similar to another output called a hillshade. So when you are working with aspect, it would be a very good idea to make sure that the file name for the data set it contains aspect in it, so you know what it is to differentiate it from hillshade. Someone that's more, or someone that's less sophisticated in GIS, if you hand them both of those things and they turn up gray, they're not necessarily going to be able to figure out which one is a hillshade, which one is actually showing you aspect. So here's a graphical example that kind of gets at how we're calculating slope and aspect. And graphically, visually, this should kind of make sense. What we're doing is we're using these grid raster cells to generate a model based on the elevation values they contain. And so the algorithms are kind of saying, well, we're going to pretend that they're actually a little bit rounded as they might be in reality. And so you're creating a surface that doesn't necessarily capture all of the detail of the terrain, but it's showing, using those elevation differences, it's calculating, all right, well, here we've got kind of a gradual change in elevation from high to low. We're creating sort of a valley flowing downhill into a valley in that direction. And so one of the ways, to think about how these output grids are calculated is like that. Okay, so we're kind of pretending that the surface is all nice and smooth and curved in describing the differences in elevation. In the DEM, they're not. They're very abrupt changes between elevation values. But the slope and aspect calculations kind of make this assumption, and they're creating values based upon what they interpret in there. So anyway, without going into a whole heck of a lot of detail on the math and geometry and trig involved with this, that's how this stuff is working. And so by knowing simply the elevation differences between the grid cells and the alignment of the grid cells, north, south, east, and west, as they typically are, with one face of that square facing each of the cardinal directions. Then we can run these calculations based upon, well, which way am I? If I face directly to the north at 0 degrees, or to the east at 90, south at 180, to the west at 270, then we can run those compass calculations, and we know that, well, where is the slope? Is it falling away from the point that I'm standing on? Is it rising up from the point that I'm standing on? What angle is it rising or falling? And then inherently, which compass direction is it facing? So hopefully, when you generate these things, you'll see the correlation between the raw DEM elevation values and how that corresponds with the slope and how fast that slope changes across space, and then basically which direction you're facing from the cell. Hillshades are a special kind of output from DEMs as a surface. The values here are just going to be 0 to 255, which indicates different levels of gray. Okay, so what a hillshade does is it looks at the DEM, and it's using the classical Swiss approach here in this example, and it's by default what you'll get in ArcGIS. So the Swiss pioneered this way of drawing terrain on maps and painting the maps, essentially coloring them, as if the sun was up to the northwest and at a 45-degree angle above the horizon. And so they calculated out, where is the sun going to illuminate the landscape? Where then is it going to cast shadows based upon the geographic location of mountains and valleys, river valleys and things like that? So that's what you're getting, is it's a depiction of the terrain as a surface. So this is kind of like, think of it maybe as, here's the landscape as if it was just gray. And so those different color changes that you see out there between white and black, the grayscale, they have no particular meaning other than it's the amount of light that is being received given the sun location to the northwest and 45 degrees above the horizon. Okay, so the sun illuminates the landscape, and then we're seeing what that landscape kind of looks like. It's very commonly used as a background in analysis and in visualization. Okay, it's used in analysis for visualization. A hillshade has no geographic information in it, so it's not something that you can add into like a site location analysis. But you could use it as the background for the visualization of the analysis, or visualization of vector data or something else that you want to display over the top of it. In any way, that's what this is commonly used for. Okay, so don't make the mistake of incorporating a hillshade into an analytical sequence. It's only something that you can use as a visualization technique. Viewshed analysis is kind of an interesting thing. It still gets used today. The classic example of doing viewshed analysis would be back in the day before we had satellite imagery and a lot of planes and things like that flying across the nation, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. When you want to monitor wildfires and spot them as quick as possible to put them out, you need to be able to detect them. And the way to do that is to put a fire lookout on top of a ridge or a mountaintop that has a clear view across the region. And so you would site it somewhere where it had a commanding view of the surrounding area. A viewshed analysis is related to that. So imagine that you're at one of these fire lookouts gazing across the landscape. What can you actually see on the landscape? What actually is visible to you? And what is hidden behind those other ridges and mountain peaks? And that's what the viewshed calculates. What's viewable and what's not viewable. From this particular example, it's not exactly clear what's going on, perhaps if you're not familiar with reading these things. So on the next slide, we'll look at more of a 3D example. So down in this example, we've got at the bottom a viewpoint, so where a person is standing, what they can see of the terrain is, in this case, highlighted in white because it's a grayscale image from our secondary text. And those are the viewshed areas. Those are the pixels that show up on the terrain from the DEM. If it was flat, they would show up in whatever color that was by default in the viewshed analysis or whatever someone chose. Here we're draping the output of the viewshed on a tin or a DEM and then colorizing the viewshed, the visible cells, as white. So this gives you an example here using a terrain as from that location. If there was a person standing there on that cell at the viewpoint, what they would actually be able to see from there is highlighted in white, and that's your viewshed. Special kind of a surface type is a cut and fill raster, which, if you think about events like landslides, volcanic eruptions, things like that, that change elevation values naturally, this operation is something that captures that and allows us to calculate how much change has happened if we have a DEM prior to the event and a DEM after the event. The cut and fill operation looks and sees where did changes occur. So the cuts are where elevation is lost. The fills are where elevation is gained. So what's happening there in the DEMs is that the DEM for after the event is capturing the amount of material that was moved or removed from the landscape, and the material that was moved or deposited after that event, during that event, right? So think about the top of Mount St. Helens when it erupted in 1980. It created a huge kind of a depression at the top where stuff was blown away and from the mountain to the north, basically, and into the air in the form of ash and rockfall and one of the largest landslides in recorded history. With a DEM ahead of that event and then a DEM generated afterwards, we can calculate how much volume was actually lost from the top of the mountain that now forms kind of a little crater up there. You can apply the same kind of analysis to Crater Lake, to Yellowstone, very large calderas where huge volcanic eruptions occurred and removed a lot of material from the landscape, deposited it somewhere else. Now, obviously, there was no computer back in those days, no way that we could measure anything that happens, but we can do an analysis of what the terrain is now and get an idea for how much material was removed. When something like the Oso landslide that happened in Washington a couple of years ago occurs, we can use high resolution LiDAR information if we to model differences between before and after that event. It also gets used in looking at things that you might not think of, like the barrier sand islands that exist along the coasts of, especially on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of Texas and other states, and then the East Coast of the U.S., where there's a lot of sand islands that are barrier islands. So after a major storm comes through, these days they can fly across it with an airplane or helicopter, maybe a drone, equipped with LiDAR, and compare it to images that they had from before and see just how much material was moved and how much damage was done to the landscape by that particular storm. So this is a geomorphology application of DEMs. So let's say we are trying to help a tank crew navigate from the brown point to the pink point on the kind of visualization to the upper left. Some of the things we might be interested in using in that analysis would be elevation itself, probably a slope input grid, perhaps aspect, and also distance. So one of the things we can calculate from point data, which is very well known, hopefully, in space, very true, accurate, and precise, generate distance grids from those distance rasters. So over on the right is an example from a road network, calculating distances from the roads, and the different colored grid cell groupings are displaying visually those distance bands away from the road. Down to the lower left would be another example of distance, but generating distance only a certain length away from the road. So that's more or less like a buffer in this particular application. You can generate a true distance grid like the one on the right first, and then resample from that by doing a query and getting distances that you're interested in that mimic a buffer. So that's what we're seeing here, is the different calculations of and uses of distance, which we'll explore in the next two slides.